Hola chiquitos, welcome to this week's lesson. I'm really excited to jump in. I know I say that every week, but I really am. This week we are going to be talking about sweetness. As you can see, we've got quite the setup here. We're going to be working with a lot of ingredients and a lot of different stages. So if you remember from the last few weeks, we've been talking about this concept about the 5 major flavors within cooking. Last week we talked about umami and what it looks like in Japanese cuisine as we cooked ramen together. The week before we talked about acidity when we cook Latin American food together. This week we're going to concentrate on sweetness, which is a part of every culture. Now, I think a lot of times when we think about sweetness, the first thing we think about is desserts, right? We think about cupcakes. I know a lot of you like cupcakes, cake, cookies, ice cream, and things like that. But there are a lot of foods in our day-to-day life that contain sugar naturally in them. So when you think of an apple or an orange or bananas, those are all foods that have natural occurring sugars in them. Another layer is when we think about dairy products. So things like sour cream, milk, cheese, butter. Those ingredients have something called lactose. Lactose is a kind of sugar that exists within dairy products. So sugar is almost impossible to escape. It's a part of a lot of our foods. And I think a lot of times we approach sugar, and maybe this is just adults, with fear or shame or guilt. We watch movies and we see when somebody is sad or feeling lonely, they reach into the fridge and they grab, a pint of ice cream and they eat it there, or they, eat a whole cake, or these portrayals of desserts and sweets can be really damaging to the ways that we believe about sweets, because then we think, if I have this, it's terrible for me, right? Or I'm gonna be bad and I'm gonna eat 2 cupcakes instead of 1. And this negative connotation, it matters. It matters the way that we think about food, because the choices that we make about food are informed by what we believe. Sugar is not bad. I want you to hear that from me. Sweets are not bad. And I don't want any of my students ever to experience shame around sugar or different kinds of foods. And like I said at the beginning, sweet as a flavor doesn't just have to do with sugar and dessert. So today we're going to be making 2 recipes. We're going to be making a salad that uses sweet elements in it. That's going to have this really bright and rich orange in it that's going to give our salad a pop of sweetness that's going to counteract with the lemon that we add to add a little bit of acidity to it. And we're going to make a chocolate chip zucchini bread. Now, before you kind of stop on me because there's zucchini in our bread, the zucchini is in there. One, it is incredibly nutritious for you. It's really, really good for your digestion. It has a lot of great vitamins in it, but zucchini is actually a great ingredient in some. Zucchini is an ingredient that's used in a lot of baking because it lends an incredible moisture to baked goods. So zucchini has a really high water content. Almost every fruit or vegetable that you have has some amount of water in it. Zucchini has a lot of it. And so what happens is that it adds a lot of moisture. I think a lot of times we think the word moist is weird, but it is the perfect word to describe what you want in baked goods, right? You don't want something dry and crumbly and that dries out your mouth. You want something that kind of melts in your mouth. And that's what zucchini is going to do for our bread. It's an added bonus that it is pretty delicious, or that it's pretty nutritious for you. And we're going to be adding chocolate chips to it to just kind of bring in, some other full elements of sweetness. And so I want to just balance these 2 things, right? This idea that, we can enjoy sweet things, and in our desserts, and we can also enjoy them in the everyday foods that we're consuming. So some good ways to kind of reframe the ways that we think about sweets is not by saying that's evil and that's bad, but thinking, what does my body need right now? So when I go for a run and I come back home, I'm sweaty, my heart is pounding, and I usually don't eat before I go out. So when I come back, I need immediate energy in my body, right? This is a really great time to have like some chocolate milk or a donut hole or something like that, because it's going to give me really fast energy. But it's not sustained energy because the sugar breaks down almost immediately in my body, right? So after I've had something that kind of revives me a little bit and gives me a little bit of energy, then I want to concentrate on eating something with a little bit of protein. Maybe I'll have some eggs, maybe I'll have a piece of toast. That's going to give me energy for a longer period of time. Now, something to know about the ways that our bodies work is when we eat things that are like starches, so bread, pasta, rice, potatoes, all of those things, as they get broken down into our body, are turned into sugars. So the main sort of nutrient that fuels our energy in our body throughout the day is carbohydrates. We've talked about some other nutrients. We've talked about protein and how it helps the muscles in our body to, expand and contract and have good blood flow through them. Carbohydrates are the main source of energy that our bodies use throughout the day. So we need carbohydrates and we need sugars, but we want to be wise about how many we have and whether the sugars that we're putting in our body are sustaining us for the long run, right? So we want to be thinking, is this something that my body's going to break down over the next several hours, or is this something that's going to give me a sugar crash in about 20 minutes? So I want you to think about that. And I think a good thing to think about anytime we're eating is to listen to our body's signals that tell us when we're full, right? When we start getting full, there's a couple of things that happen inadvertently that we might not be paying attention to. One, the first place we usually feel it is our stomach. Our stomachs start to kind of expand and we feel like, and then you might feel it like in your esophagus, like you cannot eat any more food. But one of the other telltale signals is you'll slow down as you're eating, right? So when we first start eating, we kind of dive in, and then, if you're sitting with other people around the table, you might start talking a little bit more, taking some more time in between bites, doing other things instead of just fully focusing on eating. This is a good indicator of our body telling us, you know what, we need to slow down. Maybe we have everything that we need. And so instead of targeting sweet foods as bad in our brains, I don't want us to do that, because I want us, when you're at a birthday party or you're at a holiday, I want you to enjoy your time there. I don't want you to think, oh, I'm gonna be so bad today and I'm gonna, I'm gonna eat this and it's gonna be bad for me. When you eat a slice of cake, it's gonna be an immediate sense of energy that your body gets. And yeah, maybe your body may crash a little bit later if you don't give it other things that are gonna sustain it with energy. But I don't want you to have this negative connotation in your head, right? Instead, I want you to know your body well enough to know what it's asking from you. Is it asking you for some quick energy because you've been running around all day, maybe riding your bike or going on a walk or playing hide and seek? Or is it just saying, you know what, I'm hungry. I'm hungry for something that's gonna give me energy from one meal to the next. And that to me is a much healthier way for us to think about our entire eating experience, but really specifically as it pertains to sugar and sweet foods. We're gonna start our recipe today by making sure that we have all our ingredients in front of us, because there's a lot of them today. There's a couple of different steps, and this is what happens when we're baking. So a little bit ago, you probably heard the beep, beep, beep from my oven. that's my oven telling me that it is preheated. So you want to make sure to go ahead and start your oven so it's ready to go as soon as your zucchini bread is ready to go in. So you want to start by preheating it to 350 degrees, and then make sure that you have all your ingredients laid out in front of you. I actually have a recipe out in front of me today. Baking is different in a lot of ways from the ways that we have been cooking in the last few weeks, right? When we're seasoning a salad, or when we were seasoning our shoyu ramen last week, I'm asking you to taste as you go. You can't really do that with baking because, well, first, we shouldn't be eating flour or eggs when they're fully raw, but also because science is happening anytime during food, but really specifically in baking. There's a lot of changes that are happening to our food. And so we want to be really measured and really specific when it comes to baking, because every ingredient quantity is there for a reason. When we use baking powder and baking soda, it helps our baked goods rise and get nice and fluffy. We're also going to be using a couple new utensils today, and I want you to get creative in your kitchen. If you don't have the specific things I'm telling you about, I'm going to give you some alternatives to kind of work through how you can still make the zucchini bread. So the first thing that we're going to be using that we maybe haven't used in class before is a cheese grater. This is what mine looks like. A lot of times they kind of look like tripods. The important thing is that they have these kind of little holes that shred the cheese. If you have that in your kitchen, great. That's gonna make shredding your zucchini a lot faster. And if you don't, I'm gonna teach you some knife techniques to get your zucchini nice and small so that it blends in really well with your batter. The second thing I'm using today is a loaf pan. This is just a baking dish that is just kind of long and looks like about the size of a loaf of bread. If you don't have this at home, that's fine. I want you to find a square baking dish if you can, or a rectangular baking dish. That's gonna work just fine. It doesn't have to be particularly this size. If yours is more of a square and it's larger, then you're gonna be checking your zucchini bread a little bit earlier than the direct recipe for this zucchini bread, because it's going to be flatter, and so it's going to cook a little bit faster. So the first thing that we're going to do today is we're going to take our butter and we're going to grease our pan. So whatever pan you end up using, if you have a loaf pan, great. And if not, whatever you're using instead, you want to grab your stick of butter and just kind of rub it all over the pan so that at the end, when we're trying to take out our bread, it's not fully stuck onto the pan. So once we're done with doing this, we're gonna set it aside, and we're going to put our butter in a microwave safe bowl. And I'm going to start by microwaving it for 30 seconds. We want it to be pretty melted. And then you can, if you take it out and it isn't fully melted, add it for a few more seconds until, the butter is completely liquefied. Like we've talked about the last few weeks, everybody's microwave and oven works a little bit differently. So it might take a little bit longer, or it might be really quick for you. My butter is fully melted. I'm just gonna grab it and set it to the side and allow it to cool down a little bit. The next step that we're going to do is we're gonna just go ahead and get our zucchini ready. So if you have a cheese shredder, then I want you to just start shredding your zucchini. Be careful as you get close to the bottom of your zucchini. Oh, by the way, I cut off the tip of my zucchini, like the stem part. But just be careful as you get closer to the bottom of it because you don't want to cut your fingers on the cheese grater. So if you don't have one of these at home, that's totally fine. We're gonna chop our next one and get in a little bit of good knife practice, but also give a nice alternative. So another thing that you'll notice is that I didn't peel my zucchini. The skin of zucchini has a lot of nutrients in it, and whenever, so that means it has a lot of vitamins and antioxidants in it that help boost our immune system. So we're just gonna leave that on, right? Because if we're already getting some health benefits from the zucchini, why not get as much as we can? Okay, so here's the shredded one. I'm gonna set that to the side, and then I'm gonna move to my cutting board. So the first thing, with my bear claw, the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take off. Okay, my butter is fully melted. I'm just gonna grab it and set it to the side and allow it to cool down a little bit. The next step that we're going to do is we're gonna just go ahead and get our zucchini ready. So if you have a cheese shredder, then I want you to just start shredding your zucchini. Be careful as you get close to the bottom of your zucchini. Oh, by the way, I cut off the tip of my zucchini, like the stem part. But just be careful as you get closer to the bottom of it, because you don't want to cut your fingers on the cheese grater. So if you don't have one of these at home, that's totally fine. We're gonna chop our next one and get in a little bit of good knife practice, but also give a nice alternative. So another thing that you'll notice is that I didn't peel my zucchini. The skin of zucchini has a lot of nutrients in it, and whenever, so that means it has a lot of vitamins and antioxidants in it that help boost our immune system. So we're just gonna leave that on, right? Because if we're already getting some health benefits from the zucchini, why not get as much as we can? Okay, so here's the shredded one. I'm gonna set that to the side, and then I'm gonna move to my cutting board. So the first thing, with my bear claw, the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take off the other end of the zucchini, and then I'm going to slice my zucchini in half. Okay, so working on the smaller sections is going to be helpful for me to be able to get the most precise and small pieces. So once you've cut that in half, then lengthwise, doing your bear claw, we're gonna cut that zucchini in half again. And then we're going to be really precise today. We're going to try to cut the thinnest slices we possibly can of zucchini. And this is a place where a good bear claw comes in handy to keep our fingers safe. Sometimes you have to kind of rotate your piece to get good leverage on it and to keep your fingers safe. We're gonna repeat that with this next piece. So I'm moving from the front to the back because that gives me a lot of control on how thin I want it to be. Once I have all my thin slices, I want to kind of line them up so that they're all going the same direction, because we're going to be Now cutting across, doing the same thing. I'm actually gonna do this in batches to make sure that I get the most kind of accurate and precise chop. So once I've lined them up and they're all mostly even, you're gonna come across with your bear claw and again, try to slice these into as small, thin pieces as you can. This is one of my pieces, so it is really tiny. And even after we do this, we're going to be using our rock and roll technique to get it even smaller. The reason for this is we, one, want to have really uniform kind of pieces of zucchini, but the smaller pieces that they're in, the more they'll kind of uniformly absorb into our batter. We want to have a really evenly moist zucchini bread, and chopping really precisely is going to help get us there. So we'll repeat with this other side, and then we'll do that with this other half as well. Now that we have it into mostly really small uniform pieces, we're gonna come across with our rock and roll technique to get it even smaller. So I want you to see, after we've kind of chopped our zucchini, what kind of we're looking for. They're really, really small pieces. Some of them are even smaller than the ones that we did on the cheese grater. And like I said, it's really good chopping practice. So now we're gonna get to the fun part where we actually get to start mixing our ingredients together. So as we start to get things ready to mix, you're gonna need 2 bowls. This is because in baking, you want to mix almost all of your dry ingredients first, and then have your wet ingredients in a second bowl that you mix, and then you combine the 2. This isn't just to make a big mess. It is because in baking, because there's a lot of science involved, there's a lot of chemical processes happening. Once we mix the wet and the dry ingredients, they can never be separated again. And there are some chemical reactions that happen with just the dry ingredients that we need to give them space to do that before we mix the things together. So I'll explain those as they're happening as we're mixing things together, but we're gonna get started by getting our flour, and we're going to measure out 1 cup of flour to put into our dry ingredients bowl. And then I want you to find your 1/4 cup measuring cup, because we're going to be using that next. So it's important that as we're following recipes when we're baking, we're really specific with our measuring. So you want to have your ingredients come to the top of the measuring cup. You don't want them to mound over or anything, and you want it to be really smooth. So we're gonna put in our 1st cup of flour, and then we're going to grab our 1/4 cup, and we're going to measure out 3 of these. So the total amount of flour that should be in our zucchini bread is 1 3/4 cup. So I'm measuring these out. See how I'm scooping the top to get them nice and even. And this will be my last one. Okay, there's the flour. The next ingredient that we're going to add is one of those things that creates a chemical process that is scientific. So we're going to be using baking powder and salt and baking soda. Now, baking soda and baking powder have similar names. They look similar, but they taste very different, and they do slightly different things. So the baking powder, we are going to use 1 1/2 teaspoons. Now, pay attention to your ingredients because they're probably coming in similar packaging. You want to make sure you get 1 1/2 teaspoons of baking powder, not baking soda. Baking soda has a kind of unpleasant flavor to it, and it's one of those ingredients that's in our food primarily, well, 100% for the science. So what's gonna happen when we mix in our baking powder, our baking soda, and our salt together is that this creates a chemical process that allows our zucchini bread to rise. So when we put it in our loaf pan or in your square pan, whatever you're baking in today, the batter or the dough for the zucchini bread is probably going to come up a third of the way up. We want that to at least double in size in the pan so that there's a nice kind of mound, over it. That's going to happen because of these three ingredients. And that's why it's important that we're really specific with how much we measure them out and in mixing them in as dry ingredients first, because if we mix in the wet ingredients too soon, we could shortcut that chemical process. We can undo that, and then we might not get as good of a rise as we would have if we had mixed all our dry ingredients first. So next we're going to add, in this little trifecta of rising friends, we're going to add half a teaspoon of salt and half a teaspoon of baking soda. Okay. Next dry ingredient is cinnamon. Cinnamon is this lovely spice. It's really aromatic. A little bit of it goes a long way. It's a smell that reminds me of fall, of all kinds of baked goods. Because it just complements brown sugar, which we'll be using in a little bit, so beautifully. So we're going to use 1.5 teaspoons of cinnamon in our zucchini bread today. And again, this is just gonna give it a really lovely, we're calling it zucchini bread, but it feels really a lot more like a dessert to me personally. It feels like something you would have in the morning with a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, kind of like a muffin. And this cinnamon really brings that together, because when we mix that in later with the brown sugar and the chocolate chips, it just creates a really lovely sweet base for our bread. So I'm mixing all of these dry ingredients together until I have like a similar color and I feel satisfied that the smaller quantities of the salt and the baking powder and the baking soda have had time to mix together, so that once we add those wet ingredients, they have the chemical reaction that we want them to, that causes our bread to rise. So over here, we are going to start mixing our wet ingredients. So we are going to start that by cracking our eggs in. We're going to be using 2 eggs today. Remember, when we crack eggs, we want to crack them on a flat surface, not on an edge. And then we're going to put put pressure on our thumbs right where the crack is, and just pop it right in. The same with the second one. And then the next wet ingredient that we're adding is our zucchini that's shredded or chopped up. So you're gonna fill up your measuring cups. Here you can be a little bit generous with the amount of zucchini that you put in. Remember, this is adding a lot of moisture to our bread. So when we look at our ingredients, we have the eggs, we're gonna add butter in there in a little bit, and those are really the 2 really wet ingredients when we first put this in. But this zucchini is going to, as it cooks, right, these individual pieces will shrink and the water will come out of the zucchini and into the bread. That's why it's important to chop it as small and as uniformly as we can, so that, in that batter, the moisture spreads evenly. Next, we are going to add our 1/2 cup of melted butter into our wet ingredients. And then we're adding 1 dry ingredient. And the reason that we're going to add the dry ingredient is because when you mix butter and eggs and sugar together, it creates a cream, You know, when you read a baking recipe, sometimes it'll say cream the butter and the eggs and the sugar together, and that's what we're going to be doing. When we mix these together, they become a sort of paste that we then add to our dry ingredients. We're going to use 3/4 of a cup of brown sugar, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it does a really beautiful job, especially when you add in that cinnamon and the chocolate chips that we're going to be adding in. You'll see once you bite into it that, you know, it definitely is going to taste like a dessert. I'm not just saying this because I want you to eat zucchini. This is legitimately, I was skeptical too the first time I heard about zucchini bread. So there goes one of my 1/4 cups. We're gonna add 3 of those in. And then you just are gonna mix all of this up together to cream the butter and the eggs and the sugar together before we add it into our dry ingredients. Now, one of the things you might find is that brown sugar is really, it has this tendency to clump up together because it is a high moisture sugar. And so you might need to kind of squash those clumps down a little bit as you're mixing everything together to make sure that you sweeten this really nice and evenly. Okay, so this looks good to me. So we can go ahead and add that into our dry ingredients. Now, another really important part of this step is going to be that as we incorporate these things together, that's what we're doing. We're incorporating, we're not mixing. So you just want to gently move your whisk or your spoon, whatever you're using, around in full circles, because if we overmix, we run the risk of our bread getting really tough and chewy. This can happen in baking when we overmix our ingredients, our dry ingredients and our wet ingredients. So we're just kind of going in half circles or full circles until you see no more dry ingredients left. So you want to make sure to get in the bottom of that bowl to scoop up any leftover flour. Okay, so now it's time to add maybe all of your favorite ingredient. We're going to add chocolate chips. Now, if you know you don't like chocolate, then you can totally skip the chocolate and just sprinkle a little bit of extra brown sugar over the top before you bake it. The other thing you can do is you can add, if you're not allergic to nuts, you could add some walnuts or pecans to this recipe, and that'll give you a nice textural contrast, and it'll kind of fill the void of that, what the chocolate chips do in our recipe. So our recipe calls for 1 1/4 cup of chocolate chips. We're just gonna add 1 right now because we're gonna sprinkle the 1/4 cup on top before we bake. So I'm gonna measure that out, and as I mix these 2 together, what I'm going to do is I've moved from my whisk to this spatula, and I'm going to grab the batter from the bottom and kind of mix it over the top of the chocolate chips. In baking, this is called folding. You're folding this batter together. It's a gentle way to mix these chocolate chips in without being too rough on the dough, so that, again, we don't get a rough texture for our bread. Okay, so this looks good to me. The chocolate chips are mixed in there evenly. So I'm gonna go ahead and just scoop this into our dish, my baking dish. And remember, if you're using a square, more like a dish for brownies, that's totally fine. You're just probably going to be baking for a little less time than we are if you are baking in a bread tin. because the mixture, the batter or the dough is going to be a lot thinner on if it has like a larger surface area to cover on the bottom. And so it will likely be done in about 40 minutes versus using the bread pan. This is probably going to bake for about an hour and 5 minutes, which I know is a long time to wait, but it'll be worth the wait, I promise. So I'm just gonna measure out this last little quarter cup of chocolate chips to spread over the top. And then I'm gonna grab a little bit more of this brown sugar to also sprinkle over the top of the bread, so it kind of creates a little bit of a crust on top. And that's that. We're ready to go in the oven. Remember, if you're baking in a bread pan, then you're gonna wanna put this in for an hour and 5 minutes. So set a timer on your phone, on your tablet, or on your stove itself to make sure that you check it at that point. You will know that your zucchini bread is done because you can grab a little toothpick and stick it straight through the bread, and it'll come out and it'll be mostly clean. The only thing that you should really see on that toothpick is a little bit in change of color from it going, in the zucchini bread, and maybe some melted chocolate from the chocolate chips around it. So again, if you're in a brownie pan, you're gonna put yours in for about 40 minutes. I want you to then do the toothpick test. And if it's still, if it has a lot of batter around the toothpick, then I want you to put it back in the oven and cook it for another 10 minutes, and you should be good. If you remember from the very first week, having all our ingredients out and ready to go is called mise en place. It's a French term that means everything in its place so that we can move through recipes pretty efficiently. This is gonna be really fast in comparison to our zucchini bread because we don't have to cook anything. We're just slicing things and tossing them in. So I have my spinach already measured out and in my salad bowl, so you'll want to do the same. And I'm going to grab my cucumber, and we're going to cut the ends off because the stems tend to be a little bit bitter, and then the very end of the cucumber is sometimes wilted, and we just don't want that. And then we're simply going to slice our cucumber. For the sake of practice, I want you to try to slice your cucumber as thinly as possible. It's one of the things that's really important when you're working in a kitchen or in a professional environment when it comes to food, is doing things in a uniform way. So there are some line chefs that all they do is cut up vegetables, right, to prepare for the different dishes that they could be cooking in the kitchen. And it's really important that they cut everything close to the same size so that you can really depend on the ingredients to be really uniform, to get the right amount of flavor, and to measure them out equally and evenly. Okay, so I've cut up my cucumber, and I'm going to just put it in my salad and maybe toss it a little bit so that we can spread that out. It tends to kind of stick to itself, but we want to have a well-balanced salad with all the ingredients well mixed. The next thing we are going to do is we are going to slice our orange. We've done this with the younger class, I believe, a few weeks ago, and it's called supreming an orange. So instead of peeling the orange, we're gonna slice it, and then we're gonna cut off the peel. I personally think it's a little bit easier to do it this way. So you want to bare claw at the top and slice down, and this first piece is gonna have next to nothing on it. But then we're gonna slice probably into 6 or 7 slices of oranges. Mine is particularly large, so it might be a few more than that. Just make sure that you are keeping your bare claw as you slice down to keep your fingers nice and safe. And then to supreme it and take off the skin, you're literally just going to cut around the skin, and it'll end up making like a hexagon or an octagon depending on how many pieces you have to slice it in. But you'll have a piece like this at the end, and I'm just gonna cut this in half before I put it into the salad. And you're just repeating this process until you've got all the peel off. So at the beginning of class, we were talking about sugar and how it comes in different forms. As part of our salad here, this orange is a natural source of sugar. It's something that can give our body a little bit of sustained energy. It's a little bit easier for our body to break down, and it has the added plus of having additional kinds of nutrients in them. So we talked a little bit about how our body's main source of energy, our main source of fuel, almost like the gas in a car, is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are things like pastas and potatoes, rice, and the reason that these are similar to sugars is that as our body breaks them down and digests them, our body actually turns them into sugars so that we can burn it as fuel. So things like fruit and even some, vegetables have natural sugars in them that help give our body energy, but they also have this thing called fiber, and fiber helps our stomachs be nice and regulated, and also it helps our stomachs break down other foods well. So when our bodies are breaking food down, they're breaking it down to absorb the biggest amount of nutrients. So it's breaking down proteins that can go and help our muscles recharge. It's breaking down things like iron in leafy greens like the spinach that helps our blood circulation so that we can have clear brains as we're thinking and learning through the day, and we can run around and have blood pulsing from our heart into all different kinds of our muscles. So this is like a good example of ways that we can incorporate other kinds of sugar into our diet that aren't necessarily just thinking about desserts. In cooking, we actually need sweetness to balance out a lot of flavors. So in Track A's class today, we made a dressing, and it was a raspberry dressing, and when we added in the red wine vinegar, which is really acidic, and we tasted it, we realized that we had to add a little bit of sugar, not because we wanted to make the raspberry dressing like a syrup that you would pour on pancakes, but because the first thing and the dominant flavor that you felt in your mouth was acidic, and it pinches the sides of your cheek, and we love acidity. We talked about it a few weeks ago. It creates good contrast and brightness in our food, but when it's the only thing we can taste, that's not balanced cooking. And so we added a little bit of sugar because that helps neutralize acidity to a point that is so that we could taste the salt in there and the raspberry. So sweetness can do that. In this salad, it's gonna add a nice pop of flavor in there. In other examples of like savory foods that we think about that have sugar added to them, when I make tomato sauce at home and I'm making it from scratch, I always add a little bit of sugar or a little bit of honey to my sauce because the tomatoes are so acidic that they need a little bit of sweetness to neutralize that acidity so that it doesn't hurt your esophagus or your stomach too much because the acidic content is too high. So it's not just something that we're cooking in desserts and treats and things like that. Sugar is something that we can find in a lot of foods naturally, and it's a really great way to kind of give our bodies the energy that it needs to be sustained throughout the day. So next we're going to add in our olive oil. I have my olive oil measured out, but you should use 1/4 cup, and we're just gonna drizzle this all over. So what we're doing to the salad at this point is I really like to feel my food. I feel it with my hands because I can understand the textures and the seasonings better that way. I'm a very tactile person. If you are not and textures are hard for you, then you might want to use some tongs and just toss your salad until everything is evenly mixed and you can see olive oil over all of the spinach in your bowl. So what we're doing as we're coating this is, one, we're adding an element of a healthy fat in olive oil. We've talked about this in weeks before. Healthy fats help our bodies absorb different nutrients. So they kind of act like the glue within our bodies after we eat them. So the healthy fats attract these different parts of nutrients like protein that helps our muscles, and the leafy greens that help our blood and circulatory system. And even like this orange has a lot of vitamins and antioxidants in it that help keep our immune system strong. It has a lot of natural vitamin C in it. And so the olive oil is creating a really great kind of avenue. So as we eat this, it facilitates our body's ability to hang on to these nutrients. But the other thing that it does is we're coating the spinach. Things that are leafy and green have this tendency to be a little bit bitter sometimes. Bitterness is something that we love in our food. When I think about one of our favorite ingredients, chocolate, chocolate is a naturally bitter substance, and we add a little bit of fat to it in milk, and we add sugar to it to balance and neutralize that bitterness a little bit, to create that kind of dessert flavor that we love. The spinach, when we kind of squeeze it like this, or you toss it with your tongs, what's happening is that the oils within the specific leaves of the spinach are kind of seeping out of it a little bit, and these are the oils that create a sometimes bitter aftertaste. So when we massage our greens like this, it helps them taste a lot milder and a lot more palatable to our taste buds. Okay, so next we are going to slice up our lemon. A majority of the times I'm teaching you a salad that this is how, I make most of my salads at home. Most of the times I'm not a dressing person. I literally just like a little bit of olive oil, lemon, and a good salt. We're going to be making a rosemary salt today from our garden. If your rosemary is not doing well or it hasn't survived the summer, that's okay. You can use basil or thyme perfectly into this recipe, but you'll want to get those and rinse those off. But the lemon is going to be what adds kind of a little bit of extra brightness to our salad. It's going to be that acidic thing that counters, the fattiness from the oil and the crunch of the cucumber. And it's going to season our spinach really beautifully. So I'm just going to toss that to make sure that we get lemon juice all over our salad. And then we can finally move on to our last ingredient, which is going to be our rosemary salt. This is really easy to make. I keep it on the counter, so if you just find a little bowl that you can have, since the rosemary is fresh, it is going to have a little bit of water in it, and so you want to leave it uncovered on the counter because it's going to draw out the water and the moisture, and it's going to keep the salt from clumping together as it dries out, so that you have a nice even salt. So I'm going to measure out 2 teaspoons, maybe a little bit of a heaping one here, of salt. And then I'm going to grab, I have, 3 stems. It's more like 2, but I have 1 large stem and 2 little ones of rosemary. And the nice thing about rosemary is that the leaves come right off the stem, and you want to remove them from the stem because the stem is really bitter, and it just doesn't taste great, and it doesn't have a great texture. So you can just kind of pinch at the top and pull straight down, and those leaves just come right off. Okay, so we're just going to kind of bunch them all together here in the middle of our cutting board, and we're going to do probably one of our most used chopping techniques, which is the rock and roll technique. And we want to get these pieces of rosemary as small as possible so that when we mix it into the salt, it's almost like as small as those grains of salt, so we can season things really evenly and really well. This is something that I like to put on eggs in the morning on the yolky part, or if I put a little bit of butter on some toast, I might sprinkle like some of this on that, or sprinkle them over some fresh summer tomatoes on top of like cheesy garlic bread. It's really versatile, but it is one of my very favorite ingredients to season a salad with, because I think that rosemary is a really easy herb. A lot of times when we cook with herbs, we cook with them like in a pot to add flavor to a sauce or a steak. Rosemary is one of those herbs that's really delicious raw. And for this specific salad, it pairs beautifully because I think rosemary and oranges were meant to be together. And I feel the same way about basil. So if you're chopping basil instead of rosemary, then know that it's gonna have the same effect. Oranges and basil are still really good friends with each other. So we're just gonna keep going with this process until you have really small, nice, even pieces of your rosemary to toss in with your salt. These are nice and small pieces, so I think that's perfect. And if I were to measure this out, it's probably a little over a teaspoon. So think of that as you can get creative with the other herbs in your garden and make these compound salts that have herbs or spices added to them to season your other foods. So for every 2 teaspoons of salt, you'll want 1 teaspoon of a chopped up herb. So it's really as easy as chopping your herb, and you're literally just going to mix it in together until the salt and the rosemary are evenly incorporated. And remember that you're gonna wanna leave this uncovered so that the rosemary has time to dry out, and the salt will help with that process. So if you feel better covering things up and putting them in the spice cabinet, you can do that after about 2 days. Just make sure to give the rosemary plenty of time to dry out. So that looks beautiful. You have a nice kind of green hue to that. And we're just going to, we're gonna grab a little less than a teaspoon at the beginning to season and just spread it over our salad and mix it. And one of the reasons I like mixing with my hands is because I feel like I can already tell that it's gonna need a little bit more. I also like it because I have a lot of control so that I can kind of really scoop from the bottom of the bowl to the top to make sure that I'm seasoning evenly. So I'm going to taste a few of these leaves and maybe a cucumber to see how the seasoning is. I'm imagining that I'm gonna taste the lemon a lot and that I'm going to need to add a little bit more salt, but we'll see. Feels good to be right. So I think this definitely needs a little bit more salt to really balance out that acidity. So I'm gonna get about half a teaspoon more. Spread that in and mix it around. and I'm gonna taste again to see where we're at. That's perfect. I love that subtle hint of the rosemary that's in there. The olive oil is also really delicious. One of the things I love about making a dressing with olive oil or seasoning a salad with olive oil is I really do love the flavor of olive oil. And when you do a really simple dressing like this with the olive oil, the lemon, and a compound salt, it allows you to really taste that and savor it really well so that you can recognize that flavor. So there you have it. Here is your salad with a nice fruit with natural sugars and sweetness in it. That's gonna, the orange is gonna balance with, the spinach and the cucumber with the nice fattiness from the olive oil and that rosemary salt that we made at the end. It's gonna be a little bit longer till you can enjoy your zucchini bread, so why don't you go ahead and get some natural sweetness in you with a few bites of this salad before you move on to your zucchini bread. So this looks pretty good to me. I'm gonna try, and I can tell by the resistance that that's really good, that's really clean. Any little bit that's on the toothpick is from the chocolate, which is melted. So from here on out, we're going to rest this for about 10 minutes, and then we can take it out of the pan and go ahead and slice it. Once I've loosened it, I have this spatula that I'm going to use to just make sure we've really loosened up the loaf from the bottom as well. And then I'm going to place this napkin over the bread to catch it. And place the zucchini bread on something that I can slice it on. And there you have it.